I'm now at the fourth section of this called Agency, and this is another thing that we've been sort of shown, and we certainly see this in Top Gun, where the only person who freezes, essentially, remember I mentioned the family, is Cougar, and that's it. I mean, he's got to be taken out of the cockpit. I mean, he can't be there anymore because he cares too much about his family, and he freezes. So, what we've been taught about war is that in war there are heroes, and our definition of heroes is people who are good at killing and are good on the battlefield and sacrifice themselves for others. And you probably know what a war hero should look like. I mean, so think about this for a moment. Stop this lecture for a moment. Just pause me, and fill in the blanks for what for you is your definition of a war hero. Just a few things. What would that include? Okay, have a look, or have a think. Okay, I'm assuming I'm back on now. Part of what makes a war hero is that we believe in agency. We believe that people can get onto the battlefield and they can become very effective on the battlefield. And this is this thing you see in Platoon, right? Where we see Chris, who is unable, he's paralyzed by fear. We hear his heart pounding. He can't pick up the triggers of the Claymore mines. He can't wake somebody up. He can't pick up his gun. And then they're in the middle of a firefight in an ambush, basically. And then basically 100 minutes later, there he is, and he says, there, click, 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 boom, 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 gets on his gun, and he's a hero, right? He's become proficient on the battlefield. That's agency. And we like the idea that we're in control of things. I think what happens as you get older, I don't know. Actually, I can only speak for myself and say that I entertain, I think, many fewer illusions about what I can actually control. There are things that I can exercise some control over, but most things I can do my best. But I think what I do, though, remember, say, being 20 and wanting to control everything. Wanting to make the world behave. And so when I was that age, and then I loved the idea of agency. I love the idea that there is a hero, and that the hero is somebody who takes control and gets things done and makes their own luck and so on. But Vonnegut is not having any of this. Right? On page 164, he says, there are almost no characters in this story and almost no dramatic confrontations because most of the people in it are so sick and so much the listless playthings of enormous forces. One of the main effects of war, after all, is that people are discouraged from being characters. And this is a wonderful phrase. It's so thoughtful, and it's such I think, a truth about. I mean, so he says there are almost no characters in the story. It's like, right. So if you didn't fall in love with Billy Pilgrim, or who was there to fall in love with, right? There really are no main characters because the story, although the story is about all these people who are involved, you don't really sort of get to know any of them particularly. Now, we could say about O'Brien that we get to know a few of the characters in O'Brien's stories. We get to know him, we get to know Norman Bowker, we get to know a bit about Kurt Lemon, and so on. We get to know Jimmy Cross, we get to know Martha. There are people who are drawn, fairly quickly because O'Brien is a minimalist, but we get a sense of who they are. Marianne, with her culottes in Vietnam. But Vonnegut isn't having any of that very deliberately. Because, he says, most of the people in it are so sick. Now, this is something which we don't really cover. But what happens if you think about this, essentially war is basically camping out the whole time. You are supplied, if you're lucky, with food and enough material to burn to stay warm and water. And you may have to forage. It depends on where you are. So, when the Americans and Canadians and British land in Italy and begin to work their way up the boot in the early part of the war, in the early 40s, and then the D-Day landings occur in 44, and the big push across France occurs, basically everybody's living outside, right? I mean, they're living in tents, and if they can pitch a tent, and if it's safe enough to, they may or may not be able to make a fire. They may or may not be able to have wood to burn in the area. It may be too cold because the winter was a brutal winter, and so they get sick. And they don't just get colds; they get flus, and they get bad, debilitating bugs, and they get typhoid and typhus, and they get because they have lice, and they have terrible diarrhea, and they can't eat anything, and they've got these cans of food that are just disgusting. They can't eat, and they drink water which is not clean. It's polluted, and it's got chemicals in it. And Jesus, so people, and meanwhile they have to go on fighting, right? So you ever had a flu and somebody comes along and says, "Hey, pick up your rifle"? And it's like, "No, I haven't either." If I have a flu, I'm lying on a couch somewhere going like, "Why me? What did I do to deserve this?" But basically, part of the job of being a soldier is fighting when you're sick, and you go on advancing. Now, it's changed a great deal because of the way that wars are fought, but people are very often quite ill on the battlefield. And this happened to the American troops when they went over to Afghanistan and Iraq, where they were suddenly exposed to all kinds of bugs that they had no immunities to, and they got sick, and they got terribly sick, and they could be sick for 5 or 6 weeks. Okay, and it may or may not be possible to take something like that out of the line. Okay, so they're so sick. He doesn't mean that they're sick at heart. He means they're physically ill. And so much the listless playthings of enormous forces. So, you've got massed armies moving around, hundreds of thousands of people around, and the civilians are caught in between. And it's like, it's almost not planned. It's so crazy to imagine moving this number of people. The logistics are just insane. And this is where, really, finally, logistics is going to come from. Logistics that Amazon now uses, basically, to run the world, comes really from the Second World War. It starts in World War One, but it comes from because never before have so many countries had to supply so many armies in such a short amount of time. Otherwise, the armies would just die, and you can't fight. Okay, so Napoleon always famously said, "An army travels on its belly," which means that basically the military can only advance as far as the supply line can keep up with it. And there's no point in advancing a day beyond the supply line because people will just start starving. You can't fight when you're hungry, and you can't fight if you're malnourished, and so on. So this is the change, basically, from people can be war heroes to no, it's just too big, it's too much, you're really nothing. And Vonnegut continues with this sort of, remember I was talking about programming and Skinner. And he continues with this on page 73. He says, Billy was guided by dread and the lack of dread. Well, that's pure Skinner. It's like, it's like either your fear is moving you or it's not moving you. Like there are two positions. That's it. Dread told him when to stop. Lack of it told him when to move again. He stopped on 73. So if fear governs your life, then fear will basically shut you down and stop you from participating. And when the fear lifts, you go back to doing what you were doing. That's essentially, again, part of this notion of behaviorism, where you can, if people are frightened enough, and you can frighten them with losing their lives, then loud sounds will make them feel, that's it, I'm about to lose my life, so they stop. The behavioral model, then, is that you can be started and stopped based on what's happening around you. And Billy is, as a result, put in the hospital because he has what we would have called having a nervous breakdown, but he's basically unable to function because he's so terrified, and he is trying to, as Vonnegut says on page 193, he's trying to make himself disappear. Right? He says he was among an adventure very common among people without power in the time of war. He was trying to prove to a willfully deaf and blind enemy that he was interesting to hear and see. It's like, don't find me. So shell shock, as it was called in World War One, battle fatigue by World War II, operational exhaustion, also World War II and after, now post-traumatic stress disorder, or battlefield hysteria, also World War One, which brought about, say, blindness, hysterical blindness, mutism, people couldn't speak, people couldn't walk, reminds us that the body's in charge, that fear can stop your clock, basically. Now, I'm talking about legitimate fear of death, right? If what you're facing is an anxiety attack and it seems to come out of the blue, that's something different, right? That's post-traumatic stress, usually, where the system has gotten used to getting nailed by anxiety, and so it goes, oh my God, anxiety, I have to stop, and so it stops. And at that point, what we have to do is train it. It's like, no, look around you, everything's safe. Okay, take a deep breath. Okay, continue doing what you're doing. There is nothing to fear. So there are two different situations here. One where your life is genuinely at risk all the time, basically. And that's the situation that Billy is in. Okay.